If someone called you a robot, would you be offended? Probably, right? After all, robots can't actually think for themselves. They just mimic humans by cranking out pre-programmed responses. But what if I told you that more than likely, you and most of the people you know are a certain type of robot? No, not that kind of robot. I'm talking about an ideological robot. Let's back up. In 2011, a Nobel economist claimed that liberals like him do a better job of understanding their opponent's political views than conservatives do. He said, a liberal can talk coherently about what the conservative view is because people like me actually do listen.
A liberal economist can imitate a conservative economist, can pretend the reverse is not true.
In other words, he was saying that liberals don't just mindlessly reject their opponent's ideas, and they're able to see all sides of an argument, while conservatives unthinkingly misrepresent the views they don't like. Whether or not conservatives or liberals are better at understanding their opponents isn't something we're going to tackle in this video. But it's an interesting question, and it's one that got George Mason professor Bryan Caplan thinking. How could someone show that they truly understand their ideological opponents, and that they're not just repeating pre-programmed arguments? Is there a way someone could prove they aren't just some kind of ideological robot? Enter the ideological Turing test. In 1950, famed computer scientist Alan Turing created a test that assessed whether a computer had achieved human-like intelligence. In 2011, Professor Caplan wrote about an idea he called the ideological Turing test, a way of testing a person's ability to genuinely understand their opponent's political views. In this test, you talk with someone with opposing views and try to get them to believe that you share their viewpoint. If you're able to fool them, bingo. You've passed the test. The difference here is instead of testing a machine's ability to imitate a human, Professor Caplan's version tests a human's ability to imitate their opponent's ideas. But so what? Well, consider all the bad ideas in the span of human history. Consider that most of the people at the time thought they were doing the right thing. Now consider all the bad ideas that are still dominant today, and that statistically, you're probably contributing to the survival of some of those bad ideas.
When the old steel trap in here has made up its mind, there's no turning back.
Anyone who wants to help make a better world needs to be able to discern good ideas from bad ones, to imagine the possibility that you could be wrong, and honestly consider other viewpoints. After all, it's pretty easy to think your opponents are stupid, evil, or even crazy when you're making up bad arguments for them. But what if you're forced to make their strongest arguments? It just might put your own beliefs to the test. The philosopher John Stuart Mill once said, "He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that." And Mill's right. If you don't understand the views you disagree with, then you've likely never put your own views to the test. And when you ignore or misrepresent opposing views, chances are you're not looking for the truth. The human mind is biased, and yours is no exception. But there are real ways you can defy that bias. So, whenever you're about to write off your opponent's views, give yourself a mini ideological Turing test. See if you can describe their beliefs in a way that you can honestly tell yourself they'd accept. Chances are, their arguments will look a little more reasonable, even if you still don't agree with them. But more importantly, it'll prevent you from making bad, one-sided arguments, and hopefully, bring you closer to the truth.
It's a Saturday night and you're at a house party. Suddenly the police show up and they start arresting people for underage drinking and other violations. The next thing you know, you're in cuffs and the police will search your pockets. They take out your cell phone and start to look at your recent text messages for evidence. What should you do? Tell them they need a warrant. A recent Supreme Court case just affirmed this. The police do not have the right to search your cell phone when you get arrested. That includes your texts, phone calls, photos, Uber receipts, anything, without a warrant or your consent. In the case of Riley versus California, following a traffic violation, the police arrested a guy and searched his cell phone. By looking at pictures on his phone, they were able to link him to a shooting. On appeal, the Supreme Court unanimously found that the search was unconstitutional. All 9 justices agreed. If you want to search a phone, get a warrant. Cell phones aren't the same as other personal property that police are allowed to search, and can't be treated like that because they contain far more personal data. Searching your phone is an invasion of privacy as serious as searching your home. The police need a warrant to justify that action. So if you find yourself in a tough spot and the police are asking to search your phone, remain calm and polite, but tell them you do not consent. Remember, you have the right to remain silent. And always ask for a lawyer. You might be wondering what all of this means for your computers, tablets, cameras, or other devices. While the Riley v. California ruling isn't specific, the Supreme Court implied that these same restrictions may apply. And remember, police can still search your pockets and items such as your bag and packs of cigarettes. I'm Josh Blackman, constitutional law professor at the South Texas College of Law in Houston. Tune in for a live 1-hour discussion with me to learn more about your constitutional rights and other privacy concerns. Remember, privacy is a constitutional right until you give it up.
I know how to get a free suit. All I have to do is go to Macy's, get a suit, charge it, and then when the bill comes, rip it up. Ethical issues aside, you see the main problem with this approach is that I can only do it once. The next time I go to Macy's, they'll know, because they made a note of it last time, that I rob suits, and they won't give me another one. But I have a clever idea. I'll go to Penny's and get a free suit there. But hang on. When I try to get my free suit from Penny's, they won't give me one either. Macy's has told them that I'm a suit thief. That's odd. One view of the marketplace is that it's a dog-eat-dog world of hostile competitors. The philosopher Thomas Hobbes saw the whole world that way. Since Macy's and Penny's are competitors, you might expect that Macy's would hope that I would rob Penny's next. That would even things out. But they don't. In fact, they share information about thieves. They've figured out that in the long run, it's in their mutual best interests to help each other crack down on theft. That's more important to them than short-term getting even. If they didn't share what they know, they'd be cut off from a tremendous information network about theft. So helping the other guy isn't contrary to their self-interest at all. Despite their being competitors, they have a strong incentive to be cooperative. Even more interesting is that they came up with this system on their own. It wasn't a grand design by enlightened rulers, a top-down plan. Rather, it was a bottom-up system that evolved organically by the merchants as they figured out how to manage their affairs. Long before the advent of the department store, merchants realized that cooperation among competitors was an absolute necessity. So many mechanisms in their world depend on trust and reputation issues. Not just in their world, though, in mine and yours. When I first told you my plan for getting a free suit, you might have objected that I ought to be afraid of being jailed, and that seems to require a government with a top-down plan. But even if the fear of jail were taken out of the equation, I would still have good reason to pay my bill. The same networks of trust and reputation that the merchants depend on are things that I depend on as well. To have a job, a home, a car, to be able to buy plane tickets or go to a restaurant. In an important way, we're all merchants. We all trade with each other. Not only are we capable of cooperating, we generally do. Society is full of these organic or spontaneous orders, everything from language to fashion, from internet memes to prices in a market. The basic concepts of Anglo-American common law, as well as the international merchant law, evolved in a similar fashion, the result of people's attempts to work out the most mutually beneficial ways of living and working together. So when people tell you that society can't solve its problems without force applied from the top down, you're right to be skeptical. Mechanisms that facilitate and are based on social cooperation are all around us.
If we look at the history of the world, a huge fraction of the improvements in standard of living have come because private businesses have created new products, have given people jobs, have generated profits that raise people out of poverty and allow them to live fruitful and productive lives with reasonable standards of living. We can have much more of that, and it will have beneficial effects around the world if we step back from the excessive regulation and have a much more capitalistic system. My name is Jeff Myron, and I'm Director of Undergraduate Studies in the Department of Economics at Harvard University. I want to talk about 3 myths about capitalism. The first is that being pro-capitalism is the same as being pro-business. Nothing could be farther from the truth. The point of capitalism is to make sure that businesses have to compete vigorously against each other, and that benefits consumers. It's not good for the businesses per se, because they have to work really hard. So many businesses understand this, and they hate capitalism. They're constantly trying to get government to erect various rules, restrictions, regulations that help them, but that are not in the interest of the consumers. So pro-capitalism is good for consumers. That's whom we're ultimately trying to help. A second myth is that capitalism generates an unfair distribution of income. What true capitalism does is rewards people who are productive, people who work a lot of hours, people who have a lot of talent, people who come up with good ideas. They get big rewards under capitalism, and people who don't do those sorts of things get less. The one negative one might be concerned about is that some people have very little skill. They are not able to earn very much left on their own, and so very reasonable people support some anti-poverty spending. But that's completely different than interfering with capitalism, regulating prices, limiting quantities, imposing all sorts of things on businesses. Those make the economy less productive, give us a smaller pie, and make it even harder for us to operate programs which help those who are less fortunate and because they were unlucky. The third myth is that capitalism was responsible for the recent financial crisis and the recession. That again is almost exactly the opposite of what is true. First of all, nobody who's being intellectually honest thinks that we had unbridled, serious capitalism before the crisis hit, before the subprime buildup occurred, before we had all of the housing problems. We had enormous government interventions that subsidized risk, enormous government interventions that encouraged an overinvestment housing. If one's going to try to draw any conclusions, it seems to suggest much more clearly that interfering with capitalism generates financial crises, generates recessions, because what we experienced was directly related to the incentives for excessive risk-taking, the incentives for overinvestment in housing that were created by government. The private sector responded to those incentives, so of course the private sector can't be completely absolved of being involved, but in the sense of causing, it was the bad policies that caused it, not what the private sector or capitalism did on its own. Most importantly, whenever government bail out people who took excessive risk, they encourage people to do more of that in the future. And we unfortunately went a huge way in that direction via the TARP and via all the Federal Reserve policies, which helped Wall Street and the risk takers not have to pay the true price for all the excessive risk taking they engaged in.
By definition, military production output is not real wealth. Wars destroy wealth rather than creating it. There are a number of myths about the Great Depression which are very popular. The first is that Herbert Hoover was a do-nothing laissez-faire president who simply allowed unemployment to rise and was responsible for a total economic collapse. In fact, this is the opposite of the truth. Hoover was an extremely interventionist president, and one of the main reasons why the Great Depression became so severe was because of the active and interventionist policy he followed. In particular, his refusal to allow asset values and wages to find a natural clearing level. The second myth is that the New Deal saved American capitalism and brought the Great Depression to an end. The historians generally do not believe this anymore. The fact is that in most parts of the world, the Great Depression began to end much, much earlier and much more quickly than it did in the United States. In Great Britain, the Great Depression was over by 1933, and Britain in fact enjoyed very rapid economic growth from 1931 onwards. In the United States, by contrast, not only does the Great Depression go on for more than a decade, it in fact actually gets worse, and by 1937, the level of unemployment in the United States is as high as it had been in 1932, but in addition, the federal government has built up an enormous debt. The third common myth is that what eventually ended the Depression and saved the economy was World War II. By definition, military production output is not real wealth. Wars destroy wealth rather than creating it. In fact, if you look at the figures for American economic activity and you strip out the war effects, as people like Robert Higgs have shown, what you can only conclude is that in fact the Great Depression does not really end until 1947 or 1948, and that the war simply conceals or covers up the continuing low level of real wealth creating economic activity in the United States.
To be perfectly honest, I'm not as sexy as Hugh Jackman. According to the Declaration of Independence, we're all supposedly equal. But I'm not as wealthy as Bill Gates. I'm not as tough as Vin Diesel. And to be perfectly honest, I'm not as sexy as Hugh Jackman. So what's all this about equality? One way they're my equals is our legal standing. We enjoy equal freedom to choose our path to happiness and act to secure it. We are equal in our liberty. The only way we can all have equal liberty is if we understand liberty not as the freedom to do whatever I please, but as the freedom to do whatever I please, subject to the condition that this doesn't infringe others' freedoms. The philosopher John Locke was careful to distinguish liberty from licentiousness. If we're equal, then I can't treat others as if they were my slaves. I just thought of another inequality. I think I have the best job in the world. But we can't all have the same job, then nothing would get done. But wait, does Hugh Jackman wish that he had my job? My guess is that he likes what he does, just as I like what I do. Since there's a wide plurality of human tastes and preferences, we can all enjoy what we do without all doing the same thing. Some of the things that some people enjoy, others don't like at all. Some people watch TV shows I think are awful. Listen to music I can't stand. Read books I wouldn't enjoy. But I can respect that people have different tastes and preferences without sharing them, as long as their preferences don't entail violating other people's rights. I need not respect the lifestyle choices of serial killers, the way I do respect the lifestyle choices of people who like music I don't like. I can treat everyone with equal respect as long as I recognize their equal value as persons, their equal moral worth. By the same token, the legal order can show equal respect for persons by respecting their rights equally. That's true equality. If we tried to produce equality in some other way, we'd actually be failing to respect persons, because we would either have to violate their freedom to choose, or we'd be violating the freedom to choose of someone else. For example, we could take away some acting jobs from Hugh Jackman so that I could have one. That would be a step towards equalizing things between us. It wouldn't get me on the cover of People magazine, but it would get me more money. Of course, it would also mean that his fans wouldn't be as well served. And more importantly, it would mean that both of us were denied opportunities to do what we love to do. Treating us as equals doesn't mean that he should be required to write books or that I should be required to act and sing. Treating us as equals means showing equal respect to the choices we make, provided that our choices don't entail taking away a similar freedom for others. It means we must enjoy equal protection of our rights. In many jurisdictions across the country, we're seeing more and more bans on smoking in public places. This seems like it's a conflict of rights because the smoker claims, I have the right to smoke, don't I? Whereas the non-smoker will claim, I have the right to breathe clean air, don't I? But in many of these areas, the concept of public places includes bars or restaurants. And in an important way, those aren't public places. Those are private places. The bar, the restaurants, those have owners, just like you own your home. If you're in my house, you don't have the right to smoke unless I say that you can smoke. And if I'm in your house, I don't have the right to clean air unless you say I have the right to clean air. When I'm in your house, we will either smoke or not smoke depending on what your rules are. When we're in my house, we'll either smoke or not smoke depending on what my rules are. And just as you should be expected to set the use rules for your own home, surely the restaurant owner should be able to set the use rules for what goes on in that restaurant. You don't have the right to complain that there's smoking or that there's no smoking, because it's not your restaurant. The restaurant owner knows his or her clientele, knows whether it's the sort of establishment where it would be more advantageous to allow smoking or to ban smoking. Why not let the restaurant owner make those decisions for that establishment in just the same way that you get to make those rules for your own home? You're not required to go to the restaurant in the first place. If you would like to go to a restaurant where there's no smoking allowed, then you should go to a restaurant where there's no smoking allowed. If you would like to go to a restaurant where there is smoking allowed, then you should go to that kind of a restaurant. But to frame that in terms of rights is to miss the point of whose rights are in question. It's not really a matter of smokers' rights versus non-smokers' rights. It's really a matter of property owners' rights. You have the right to smoke in your property, and you have the right to have a smoke-free environment in your own property. But you don't have a right to one condition or the other in somebody else's property. The property owner's rights are the ones that should determine the rules for use of that property. You don't have rights that override the property owner's rights. If I'm in your restaurant, it's up to you whether I can smoke or not. not up to me.
Natural disasters, terrorist attacks, and wars have one thing in common. They involve a lot of destruction. But every time there's a natural disaster, or a terrorist attack, or a war, you can be virtually guaranteed that someone is going to come along and say that there's a silver lining in all of this. It's good for the economy because it's going to create jobs. When there's a natural disaster, or a terrorist attack, or a war, we have to spend money replacing all the stuff that gets destroyed. This is an application of what we call the broken window fallacy. Frederick Bastiat corrected this fallacy in his early 19th century essay, That Which Is Seen and That Which Is Not Seen. The key point is that destruction does not create prosperity. Destruction destroys prosperity. Imagine someone who owns a shop. The shop has a glass window. Now a kid comes along and throws a rock through the window, so the window's broken, shattered glass everywhere. The shopkeeper's upset. Why? Because his window's been broken. He has to go and pay the glass maker in order to get the window replaced. Now some people might come along and say, well no, look, you should all be smiling because this is going to create jobs. You spend money on new glass. The glass maker earns this money. He can then spend it at restaurants, and he can spend it on new clothes, and he can spend it on things that he likes. That's going to create jobs for other people. This money's going to circulate, and we're all going to be richer as a result of the fact that this kid has thrown a rock through a window, and now we've had to replace a window. Let's think for a moment about what the policy prescription would be if it were in fact true that this is a good idea. What we should do, instead of trying to prevent people from breaking things, instead of trying to prevent people from destroying property, we should in fact be enlisting armies of kids with rocks to go around breaking windows, to destroy things. Because after all, if this would require new spending that would make us richer, that would make us better off, that would be the path to prosperity. Destroying things, breaking things, and then spending money to replace them. What we're doing when we indulge this kind of thinking is we're focusing our attention on what is seen, but we're not taking account of what is not seen. What we don't see is what the shopkeeper would have used that money for if he hadn't had to replace his window. He might have used it to buy a suit. This would have created an opportunity for a tailor. The tailor then could have spent the money on something else. He could have used it to buy groceries. This would have created opportunities for grocers. Maybe he would have saved it. Then the money could be lent to someone who wants to start a new business. He could have done something else that would have created job opportunities for other people. The world would have still had the window, and it would have had the benefit of all of this additional activity that would have gone on had the window not been broken in the first place. On net, society is worse off to the tune of one window. Whenever we actually destroy resources, that's precisely what we're doing. We're destroying stuff. We're not creating wealth. It's important to remember that it's production that creates prosperity and not destruction.
One often heard contemporary economic myth is that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. Like any myth, there is a nugget of truth to this. For example, if we look at the data, the top 20% of income earners today do have a larger share of national income than they did in the past, and the bottom 20% of income earners do have a smaller share of national income than they had in the past. There's two problems with that data. First of all, that data doesn't tell us anything about the absolute condition of the poor. Just because one has a smaller share of income doesn't mean that one is absolutely poor. So for example, it could be the case that even though poor Americans have a smaller share of national income, their absolute income is higher. If I asked you, would you rather have a sixth of a pizza or a ninth of a pizza, your answer might depend on how big the pizza is. And having 1/9 of a pizza might be better if the pizza was much larger than the one of which you'd have 1/6. The real income of poor Americans today is higher than it used to be, even though their share of total income is somewhat lower. But all this misses the more fundamental point. The bigger problem is that data is snapshot data that compares wealthy people in one year with wealthy people in years before, poor people in one year, poor people years before. What it doesn't take into account is the movement in individual households through time. If we could track individual households, we might be able to know what happens to poor people in, say, 5 years or 10 years or 15 years. And in fact, we do have that data. One set of data shows that between 1979 and 1988, 86% of households that were poor in 1979 were no longer poor in 1988. A second set of data from the University of Michigan shows that of households that were poor in 1975, over 95% of them were no longer poor by 1991. One of the most important things to understand when we talk about the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer is this idea of income mobility. The reality is for most Americans that they start off poor and then they slowly become richer over time. And in fact, if we look at that data comparing 1975 and 1991, what we find is that the average income gain for rich households over that period was just about $4,000, but the average gain for poor households over that period, $28,000. So what really happened between 1975 and 1991 is that the rich got richer, but the poor got richer a lot faster than the rich did. So whenever we talk about rich and poor, we have to take account of this issue of income mobility. So how can it be that most Americans are getting richer while we know that there's still plenty of poor people out there? Well, the fact is that one of the things that happens over time is who comprises the income distribution changes. Immigrants, young people entering the labor force come into that income distribution at low levels of income. They become the new poor, while the old poor slowly move their way up. So even though a first glance at the data may make it seem like the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, the reality of the United States in the early 21st century is that everybody's getting richer, rich and poor alike. And the idea that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer is largely a statistical artifact and mostly a myth.